Hi, folks. Thanks for joining us for today's webinar sponsored by JJ Keller. We are going to let our audience settle in for just a minute and we'll be starting the presentation shortly. Thank you. Thanks again for joining us, folks. We're going to give our audience just a few more seconds to settle in and we're going to begin the presentation shortly. Thank you. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Safety and Health Magazine webcast, Lockout, Tagout, How to Put OSHA's Requirements into Practice, sponsored by JJ Keller. My name is Barry Botino. I'm an associate editor at Safety and Health and a co-host of the On the Safe Side podcast. I'll be serving as the moderator for today's event. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping items to share with everyone. The views of today's speakers and organization are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of the National Safety Council or Safety and Health magazine. Any mention of a commercial enterprise, product, or publication does not mean the council or the magazine endorses those items. At the conclusion of today's event, we'll conduct a Q&A with our speakers. If you have a question, just click that Q&A button located at the bottom of your screen, type in your question, and press the send button. You can submit those questions at any time during today's event. After this presentation, you'll also be asked to complete a brief evaluation survey, but I'll tell you more about that a little bit later. This webcast will be archived. If you want to view this presentation or any of our past webcasts, please go to safetyandhealthmagazine.com/events. Now let's introduce our speakers. Joining us today are Cindy Pauley and Joe Prue. Cindy is an editor on the JJ Keller EHS content team. She has 13 years of experience in safety program development and management in the oil and gas, chemical, manufacturing, construction, and agricultural industries. She leans on that expertise to develop a variety of easily understandable content for JJ Keller's customers and partners. Joe joined the EHS editorial team last year after serving in prominent roles in the manufacturing sector and higher education. Joe is a certified safety professional and a Six Sigma Black Belt. He has earned multiple academic degrees, including a Master of Science in Environmental Safety and Health. Again, we thank you all for tuning into this presentation. And Cindy, whenever you're ready, please take it away.
I am ready. Thank you so much, Barry, for that great introduction. As always, we love working with you. And thanks to everybody, all of our participants for joining us today. We know your time is valuable and we are grateful you've chosen to spend your time with us right now. Today's webcast, as mentioned, is presented by JJ Keller Safety Management Suite. And it's really just a safety solution that works as hard as you do. The Safety Management Suite, it's intended to streamline compliance at every level for your business, making it easy to develop, implement, and maintain an industry-specific safety program. Because your success is a priority to us, today's attendees will be offered complimentary access to our compliance tools and resources within that Safety Management Suite, what we like to call SMS. On behalf of our sponsor, JJ Keller's Safety Management Suite, again, thank you for joining us. So we just want to throw out an introduction by throwing some stats out to everybody. Each year, about 3,000 workers are injured from being caught in equipment. 60 workers are killed in similar exposures. So that's why lockout tagout is so important to us. During the webcast, we're going to take a look at the difference between lockout and tagout, the duties of personnel, procedural steps involved in lockout tagout, some exceptions to the rules, and more to help you understand and comply with the regulations, and also more importantly to prevent those injuries that we don't want to see on anybody's workplace. Any worker who operates or works around a machine can be exposed to certain hazards, as we all know. Many of your injuries or workplace injuries happen when workers try to clear jams from equipment without following lockout tagout procedures. So it's really unfortunate there. In other words, when workers bypass machine guards to clear a jam without stopping the machine and controlling the hazardous energy, they're definitely a risk of serious injuries or even death. Now, according to OSHA, craft workers, electricians, machine operators, and laborers are among the 3 million workers who service equipment routinely and face the greatest risk of injury if they're not doing proper lockout tagout. And these injuries from exposure to hazardous energy require an average of 24 working days for recuperation. So there's a potential for a lot of lost downtime or a lot of downtime there as well. Sorry, trying to get my computers here clicking through too. Sorry about that. So in an effort to modernize the designs, manufacturers may use computer-based controls in their equipment, but you want to be cautioned that recent technology or technological advancements that use computer-based hazardous energy controls, these might be things like mechanical, electrical, pneumatic, chemical, and radiation. They may conflict sometimes with OSHA's existing lockout tagout standards. So you want to be really careful on which ones you're using and look deeply into that. Additionally, there are some national consensus standards and international standards that are trying to harmonize things to govern the design and use of these computer-based controls. This approach of controlling that hazardous energy is more accepted in other nations, which raises issues of needing to harmonize US standards with those. So again, kind of on the front line of that, the leading edge of those sorts of things. So just want to make you aware of that as well. The agency has recently seen an increase in requests for variances for these devices also. So a planned update to the standard is on a bit longer of a road now than they originally anticipated. OSHA issued a request for information, or what they call an RFI, back in May of 2019, just so they could better understand the strengths and limitations of the new technology, as well as potential hazards that technology could present to the workers. So where does this sit now? As of March of this year, the request for information, you can see, was pushed from May 20th of 19 to 12/23 of 2020. So that put that further in ahead, which means that the comments can come in for a longer time period, which is now going until February of 2021, which also pushes the notice of proposed rulemaking into August of this year. So every little thing, every little step of the rulemaking process pushes the other steps forward, as you can imagine. So when they extend that request for information, it extends the final rulemaking deadlines as well. So the soonest you'll see anything on that will probably be fall of this year. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Joe so he can just kind of see where everybody sits with a knowledge check, I believe. Is that right, Joe?
Yep. Thanks, Cindy. So yeah, we want to start out here with a quick knowledge check. And we're often asked to explain the difference between service and maintenance when it comes to lockout tagout. So take a second, what do you think? Is there a difference? You can go ahead and post something in the chat if you want. Think about that. While you're thinking about that, I just want to remind you again that if you have specific questions that you'd like us to answer at the end of the webinar, go ahead and make sure you use the Q&A feature in Zoom so we can catch those questions and make sure that we answer those for you. All right, so let's take a look here.
Oh, we're getting a lot of people coming in for saying false, Joe.
Okay.
It looks like, right. Yeah, false, lots of false. Some people saying they think it might be the same. Okay, some saying they're different. Yeah.
Some believe it's true. So let's take a look. Let's take a look. So it depends. so not a great response, but it does. It really depends. So maintenance, is typically something done on a schedule. We have a maintenance schedule. Our maintenance people come in and they complete the schedule, like getting your oil changed or different things like that. Whereas servicing, commonly thought of as something done as needed. So we need some sort of service, something broke down. Maintenance, again, usually something performed internally. Again, our maintenance technicians internally do these types of tasks. And service, often performed by an outside vendor or contractor. Now, again, these terms are sometimes used interchangeably. But OSHA in the 1910-147 really defines them together, kind of stating that service and or maintenance. So they bring them together as far as the components of lockout, tagout, and some of the needs of lockout, tagout. So when OSHA talks about servicing and or maintenance, they kind of break that down and say it's workplace activities such as, constructing, installing, setting up, adjusting, inspecting, modifying, all these different things that we do, throughout the day, throughout our shifts on our machines and equipment. And some of these activities can include, cleaning, inspections, troubleshooting, making adjustments, tool changes, you know, and any of those other types of activities. And now that we're talking about, lockout, tagout, where these employees may be exposed to that unexpected energization or startup of the equipment or release of that hazardous type of energy. So they also break down setting up a little bit too, as any work performed to prepare a machine or equipment to perform its normal production operation. And that's really kind of one of those key statements in the whole standard itself, is that normal production type operation. Now, there is a minor servicing exception, and that's really for minor tool changes and adjustments and other activities which may take place during these normal production operations. And they may be exempt from lockout, tagout standard only if the activity, OSHA uses the terms, is routine, repetitive, and integral to the use of the equipment for production purposes. Okay, and also provided that the work is performed using alternative measures to ensure that your employee is protected. Okay, and keep in mind, the employer really bears the burden of demonstrating, and this can be on a case-by-case basis, that the minor servicing exemption does apply. Okay, so again, the employer really bears that burden. You need to determine that. And what's kind of one of the best practices and keys to this is make sure you document that. Again, if something isn't documented as far as in the safety world or in other aspects, it didn't happen. So we have to make sure that if we're making that decision, we document, we keep that document as a record. So if someone does ask, we can say, this is the reason why we're doing it the way we are. So that was a lot to be said there, but thanks for the great responses, and I'll send it back to you, Cindy.
Yeah, that was a great response. And technically, I think everybody was kind of correct on that.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit more about what lockout actually is. A lot of people on the call probably already know, but just to reiterate for some newbies maybe that are out there, that OSHA regulates lockout. Joe mentioned the standard being 1910-147, and technically the official name is the Control of Hazardous Energy. We like to all call it lockout, tagout, but I like to go back to that, or the actual title of Control of Hazardous Energy, because that's what's important here, right? Not just locking it out, we're controlling the energy that can hurt people. And if your employees service or maintain those machines, like Joe was just talking about, where the unexpected startup or the release of that stored energy could cause injury, that's when the OSHA's lockout, tagout, or control of hazardized energy comes into effect and applies to you. The standard applies to all sources of energy. That includes those I mentioned earlier: mechanical, electrical, pneumatic, hydraulic, chemical, even thermal energy, so heat and steam, things like that. All those sources of energy. Don't forget gravity and stored energy like springs. Those sorts of things kind of sneak up on people. They don't think about it readily. But lockout refers to the process of installing a lock on an energy isolating device. And this is going to include things like circuit breakers, disconnect switches, shut off valves, things like that. Whatever it's going to take so that the equipment can be operated until the lockout device is removed. Tagout, on the other hand, refers to the process of attaching a tag to an energy isolating device. And this is to warn other people not to restore the energy to the equipment until that tag has been removed. Now, a tag should only be used, and this is where some people get in trouble too, should only be used when the machine will not accept a lock. So it's not designed anywhere on it. There's no place designed where you can fit a lock. Very rare in today's world with newer equipment that are, with lockout having been around for a while. Most equipment now is going to be able to house a lock, so you'll need to use that lock. So you'll notice with the tag out, I said should, right? So it should be used. OSHA does allow employers to still use tagout if the equipment will accept lockout as well. However, the tagout system, again, these are extremely rare circumstances, but that tagout system must provide a level of safety equivalent to the lockout. So if you can't fit a lockout on a piece of machinery, you're using a tag, it has to be equivalent to a lockout, meaning people can't de-energize it. The employer has to demonstrate that the level of safety, like blocking of a controlling switch or the removal of a valve handle, those sorts of things are alternate methods that could help. Taking these extra steps to reduce the likelihood that the machine can start is really what OSHA is looking for. And Joe mentioned burden of proof earlier. So again, the burden lies on the employer here, as is often the case, to ensure proper use of lockout. So just some things to keep in mind. You may be surprised to hear that agriculture, construction, maritime industries, certain industries like that, oil and gas well drilling, and servicing are not covered under the lockout standard. And that's only because they have their own standards. So rest assured, they're still being covered by requirements so that their employees are safe. So just keep in mind that those have their separate requirements for lockout. So keep in mind if you're in one of those industries. Electrical hazards from work on, near, or with conductors or equipment in electric utilization, like premise wiring installations, aren't covered by lockout, but instead again have their own regulation. Those are actually covered under subpart S. Joe, remind me, we should probably put subpart S on this slide so that people have that right in front of them.
Oh, sure.
Hot tap operations, just want to talk about those a little bit. These are mostly on pressurized pipelines that distribute things like gas, steam, water. Petroleum is another good one. They are not subject to the lockout standard. Instead, they also have other requirements. So again, OSHA recognizes that there are some unique differences among different industries. So they do make sure that there are regulations that apply to each of those industries, but general industry pretty much will be covered by 1910-147. Finally, if you've all probably heard of this, is cord and plug. So we'd like to include cord and plug. Most people are familiar with this. The lockout tagout standard doesn't apply to cord and plug machines where exposure to hazardous energy is controlled simply by unplugging the equipment. And there's another caveat to this that some people forget, where the employee performing the service or maintenance has exclusive control of the plug. Okay, so that doesn't mean that they can unplug something and walk away, have lunch or whatever. They still have to be in control of that if there's service that's going on with it. So that is part of the cord and plug exception that people forget. Paragraph A of the standard, which again is 1910-147, reminds us that cord and plug applies if electricity is the only form of hazardous energy to which the employees may be exposed. So the exception covers many of your portable hand tools and some cord and plug connected machinery or equipment. So now that we know what's not covered by the standard, I'm going to jump back to Joe so he can talk about what is. Joe?
Quite a bit not included in the standard, but yeah,
Right?
let's talk about what is. Again, those normal production operations are not covered by the standard. So we always want to keep that, outside and separate. And why is that? Well, it's because normal production operations don't ask employees to bypass the safety features or place themselves in harm's way. When we have those normal production operations, we've planned to keep our employees safe. And a lot of times these are tied to other standards, machine guarding or things like that keep our employees safe. So, however, and barring that minor servicing exception that Cindy talked about, most servicing and maintenance during normal production operations is covered by the standard if. And the big if is if an employee is required to remove or bypass a guard or other safety device, or if an employee is required to place any part of their body into an area on that machine or on that piece of equipment where the work is actually performed. So that in that point of operation. So where that punch comes down, where that press comes down, those are the areas. If I'm going to place my body inside of there, just logically we think we got to do something to make sure that that energy, can't harm me. So let's take a little look and some of the descriptors on what these devices are that we're going to be concerned with now. And OSHA's pretty clear on identifying, well, that's one of them, but identifying on what that means and what those devices should be. So the first one is identifiable. And these locks and tags must identify the person who's applying them. So OSHA wants employers to use names, not numbers, titles, or departments. That, those can be somewhat vague and not as clear. And really, we want those names, and that should identify who applied the device. It quickly identifies the person responsible, and who to contact for information or on status of the job. As a best practice, in my experience, and this came from one of the first trainers I ever had in safety, is I always had the picture, and you can see in my example there, the picture also. And the reason for that is not because we want people's mugshots on these tags, but it really adds a human quality to a certain degree where I see an actual person is working on this piece of equipment. And that's important. Maybe that gives, person just that second thought, that second guess, when they see those tags, that there's a human behind this. And there are some other ways to, identify the authorized employee. We can engrave names on locks. We can add a small, metal tab, for example, on the locks or things like that. So there are some, optional ways, as long as we make sure they're identified. Next is exclusivity. So lockout tagout devices must be used exclusively for lockout tagout. So they're not to be used on toolboxes, lockers, other common areas. Plain locks, master locks, these can't be used for lockout tagout. This is just one more way to ensure that workers understand the significance of lockout tagout and that energy control. The next one then is standardization. So this really helps employees recognize the program in itself and the lockout tagout equipment. So we want to standardize that equipment. Locks must be standardized with the same color, shape, size, as you can see kind of in the pictures there. And tags must use a standardized print and format. Again, you as the employer can determine what that standardization is. But it's unique then to your organization, which you would train your people on. The next component to these devices is substantial. So this is all about they need to be strong enough. It must be able to hold up under what OSHA uses, the conditions of use. So this is especially important, for tagout, especially when you're in maybe, environments that are more corrosive, wet or dirty, or you want your equipment to be substantial. So in a warehouse situation, maybe, you get away with, a little less, in the devices you have, but in a manufacturing organization where it's highly corrosive, dirty, and everything else, want to make sure they're substantial. The other thing is tags. They must be attached with a non-reusable, as OSHA says, self-locking, nylon cable tie or equivalent. And again, that number, who a lot of you are probably aware of, is that 50-pound brake limit, and that's what's required. So again, it needs to be substantial, meaning somebody just couldn't walk by and rip it off or break it off with a simple tool. Another component is, how many of these devices should you have around? So I look at it a couple ways. And OSHA doesn't necessarily specify how many you have to have, but we can look at this a couple ways. If you have only a few authorized employees, in my experience, it may be easier and more feasible to have each authorized employee just to have their own kit. Okay, but now when you get into a larger organization, this may be more challenging and maybe, as far as cost goes, a little less feasible. And so another option here is to set up like a lock storage area, or you get a lockout board. There's a couple advantages to this. One is now you have a group who can use kind of, the lockout devices and equipment, but also it's a nice visual for, are some of those devices being used, or are we missing some of those devices instead of, and I was thinking about this earlier, I, as a maintenance person, need to go out and do some work on a piece of equipment. I open my toolbox, my lock is gone. Well, in this way, if we have kind of this group set up, this lockout board, we know that right away, and we can make sure that we get kind of that inventory refresh. Also, if we go with this kind of group version, employees are going to be less tempted to lock their lockers, toolboxes, things like that when there's a designated place for them. So a little bit about lockout devices. Then I think I'll send it back to Cindy to talk about some of those different roles within lockout tagout.
Sounds good. Thanks, Joe. Great overview on that equipment. OSHA does identify 3 roles for employees under the lockout tagout standard, those being authorized, affected, and then the general category of other. So you want to be sure to draw the line to keep employees from taking on other responsibilities they're not trained to do. And so for that, let's just kind of tackle each one of these briefly, one at a time. First of all, authorized, these are the employees that are going to actually do the work, the servicing, the maintenance, the repair. They're the ones that are applying the locks or the tags, and they're following the lockout tagout procedures that you've put in place for your organization. Authorized employees need to be, they need the most detailed training. So when you are thinking about training, you want to make sure that they understand the purpose and function of the program itself. They need to be trained to recognize all those energy sources that we talked about, and then the other ones that might apply in your unique circumstances. They need to know the type and magnitude of the energy available in the workplace. So if you're talking about electrical, is it a, is it a 120 volt or is it a 480 volt? Those are very important things that the authorized employees need to know. Know how to properly control the energy. So will this particular device work? Won't this device work to control the energy? How many different places do we need to control the energy? Things like that. So that's very important part of training for them as well. Know how to isolate the equipment from its energy sources. So know whether you have to go all the way downstream or just the nearest breaker box, things like that. So very important information for the authorized person to understand. So when it comes to affected employees, these are those folks that operate or use the machines that are being serviced. So it's your equipment operator, essentially. Sometimes these are the same people, but for the most part, the OSHA does see 2 different roles designated for these folks. The affected employees are most likely to notice that the machine needs repair, so they're going to probably be the person to report it. They'll also be most affected by the lockout because the equipment can be used, right? So they're going to be sitting around waiting to see if anything's been fixed. They're also going to be the ones that are most tempted to start it up when maybe somebody's not ready. So another important reason why we do lockout. They don't do any service or maintenance work and must steer clear of the equipment during those repairs. If the employees want machine operators or other affected employees to do any maintenance or repair work on a machine, they have to be trained, step up to that next level of training as authorized employees. Most employers have employees who don't operate machines or do any equipment or service maintenance work. This will be somebody like maybe an engineer that's out there. Some supervisors don't even do the maintenance. They're there to supervise. So that's their role. They are going to fall in that category of other. Okay, so and the standard says that all other employees who work operations are or may be in an area where energy control procedures are being utilized. They have to be instructed about the procedure, about the prohibition on trying to start equipment that's locked out, how to recognize those devices that Joe just covered, and things like that. So just to get a little idea there. So we're often asked, one of the most common questions we get are about temporary workers when it comes to lockout. Remember, as joint employers, both the host employer and the staffing agency or the temporary agency are responsible for ensuring that temporary employees are protected. Okay, so prior to beginning work, the host employer and the staffing agency, they should really get together and jointly review all the task assignments, all the job hazards so that they can identify, eliminate, and control any hazardous energy release issues, and determine the coverage of temporary workers by the lockout tagout program. The host employer is responsible for ensuring that those temporary workers are performing activities covered by lockout. They're properly trained and understand the employer's lockout tagout policies and procedures. Also, OSHA requires the same protections and hazardous energy control for temp workers as is provided by employers to those permanent workers that they have. So treating everybody the same across the board. Now, when it comes to the staffing agencies, they aren't off the hook either. They have to clearly understand the types of energy hazards, things like that faced by temporary workers, and provide training required to ensure protection. Typically what happens as far as the training goes is the staffing agency is going to provide like the generic lockout tagout information and training. They might talk about the OSHA standard, the general topics that we've been covering so far, like types of devices and things like that. So they're going to cover the generic information and training. The host employer is going to provide that site-specific lockout training, and they're going to go over the procedures as well, because those are really specific to the site. And they want to make sure that the temporary employees are doing things right while they're on their work facilities. Staffing agency must still communicate with their temporary workers, though, to ensure that they understand those lockout tagout procedures. So when they're being informed by a host employer, the staffing agency still wants to make sure that they're understanding that. Another source of lockout tagout confusion are contractors. So when an outside contractor services or maintains machineries, like you have a vendor that comes in and does that, the on-site employer and the contractor, again, just similar to the temporary, they have to inform each other of their respective lockout procedures, okay? The on-site employer also must ensure that the affected and other employees understand and comply with all requirements. Okay, so you're going to have a contractor that's authorized, they're coming in doing the lockout, but you still need to inform your employees of what's going on with that. They need to be aware of that. Let's see, let's move on to a little bit more on training. The lockout standard requires that employees are trained several different times, right? So initially, they also need to be trained before performing service or maintenance on equipment. They need to be trained as needed for proficiency. So if you're seeing some behaviors or activities that aren't quite up to snuff or up to regulatory requirements, you want to retrain for some proficiency's sake. And or when there are newer revised procedures or equipment. So you get a new piece of equipment in there, you don't have a procedure for it, create the procedure for lockout tagout, you'll want to train them on that. You might be surprised that annual training for lockout is not technically required by OSHA. That one usually shocks people, but it's not actually required. And usually, you'll notice that when you're doing training, it's going to end up probably being annual anyway, because you're all those things I just listed, right? You're going to need proficiency when procedures change. That's happening all the time. So most times this is going to happen anyway. But from my experience, annual training is still a smart move, just to make sure that you're not missing anything, that if equipment doesn't often need servicing or maintenance, that you're covering that stuff. As with any other skill, don't forget, if we don't use it, we lose it. So we want to make sure that, this is a life-saving regulation. People have, this is written in blood. As with most, we like to say that it's written in blood. Somebody actually was really hurt, or unfortunately we've lost people, is why we have this particular regulation. So we want to make sure people understand how to use it. Now for training, employers must certify that the training was provided, and they need to include the employee's name and date of the training. OSHA doesn't establish retention times for training records, but they may want to review them during an inspection. So it is advisable to maintain records at least until your next training session as a minimum. So just kind of keep it between training. Besides, maintaining a complete set of these records is also going to show a history of compliance, which OSHA really, really likes to see. Some people recommend keeping training records for at least 5 years. Others for the duration of each trained worker's employment. Do what works best for your company. If you're doing training often, that's gonna be a lot of records if you keep them for 5 years or for as long as you need them. But if you have lack of proficiencies or things like that, or you're finding commonalities, you may want to keep things a little bit longer. But just make sure that you're keeping those for what works for you, and so that you have documentation in case an enforcement officer were to ask. And Joe already mentioned, remember that stuff that isn't documented was not done. So another good reason to keep that stuff on your docket. So now let's talk a little bit about refresher training. There are some times when that's going to be necessary, whether it be for authorized or affected employees. Basically, this is similar to what we just talked about. You'll need retraining when there's a change in job assignments. Let's say somebody has never used to work in maintenance. Now they've been promoted to maintenance or moved over to maintenance. There's a change in job assignment. They're probably going to now need to be an authorized employee. So you'll need to give them training. If there's a change in energy control procedures. So let's say you've changed up your equipment. You'll want to make sure that there's refresher training. Periodic inspections reveal that there are deviations in your energy control procedures. You'll want to make sure you do a refresher training on that when you get that resolved. It's believed that if you find that there are deviations or inadequacies in the employee's knowledge, like we mentioned before, you'll want to do a refresher training. again, you must keep a record of retraining that includes the employee's name and date, just similar to the original training. So the employee's name and date. A lot of people think that you have to have a signature by each employee attending training. That's not true. Another myth out there that we'll bust today. You just need their name and their the date of the training. So they do not need to sign that. And I think we might have a poll. Is that right? I think we have a poll for everybody.
We do. We do.
All right, so you're going to see a poll there. And since JJ Keller Safety Management Suite is sponsoring our event, we want to give you guys an opportunity to access customizable plan templates and award-winning training programs, including PowerPoint presentations. We have 5-minute safety talks that you can use, like a tailgate meeting, classroom exercises, just to quiz people, and so much more. You'll love these resources, I promise. So if you want to select your interests on the poll here, we will make sure that you get access to that complimentary access. So I think we can, are we able to go to the next screen? I think we
I
can.
think so.
All right. Okay, so yeah, so go ahead and use that poll to select your interests. And along with that complimentary access, we're going to send you a free white paper. You can see that one here today. It's called Basics of Electrical Safety. This paper basically answers 13 top questions that apply to basic electrical safety, including what the OSHA standards cover and don't cover. So really good white paper there that we would like to share with you. And with that, I'm going to bounce it right back to Joe.
All right, Cindy, take a breath and take a drink because that was a lot. But thanks sending it back to me. So yeah, I get to talk about lockout takeout procedures. So love lockout takeout procedures. But these procedures, and depending on the size of your organization, and if you haven't started working on these yet, you may look at this is quite a daunting task. And I always like to start out this component of this discussion with, don't be afraid to get help with this, especially in your organization. Get other people, train them up on what a procedure is, and have them assist you in their areas. If you have nice department breakdowns, you can have kind of a leader or a champion in each area to really help you work through these procedures, because they are so important. But there is a lot of initial work to really get them up, running, and correct. So there's nothing wrong with bringing in that extra help. Anyway, back to the procedures. So the lockout tagout standard does require written procedures for isolating the energy sources for each machine. Okay, so OSHA does have a sample of what this looks like in Appendix A of the 1910-147, or within Safety Management Suite, we also have templates that you can utilize for that. Now, OSHA uses the word specific really to emphasize the need for detail. Each machine has its own types of energy and locations of operating controls, types of energy isolating devices, and stored energy. Each machine is unique, so the procedure needs to take that into account. Each procedure needs to have enough machine-specific detail so it's useful to the authorized employees. Again, now we're coming back to, it's up to that employer to really ensure that the right information is out there. So the procedures themselves should be an outline of the instructions on how to disconnect all the energy sources from the machine. They should have, the basic name, ID, and number on the machine, the different energy sources, describing the machine's controls. So for example, are they toggle switches, knobs, dials? What are they? Identify the location of disconnect switches, breakers, valves, things like that. Also in relation to, a navigable point. So like the operator station. And that makes it, simpler and easier for a person who's completing this procedure to know exactly where to go and what to do. Also be descriptive. So, what are the steps to really take to verify the equipment? Be descriptive on what that is. Are there gauges? Are there indicators, lights to check? Where are they on the machine? Some employers like to include photos, and I highly recommend, I've always included photos. Photos tell you 1,000 words, right? So if I can have a photo of exactly how to lock something out and where, boy, that tells a lot. It saves a lot of writing too, if you can have that explanation right there. And then, of course, remember to update these procedures as needed. Accuracy is essential. So when operations or equipment changes, your procedures need to as well. And again, this is where kind of some of that maintenance and that daunting piece may seem out there, but That's where you want to make sure you have those champions and the right amount of resources for that. And then also procedures need to be accessible. So you can keep them by the machine, you can have them electronically. Either way, you need to train your workers on where they're kept. Best practice, have them right on the machine. Then there's no question on which procedure goes with which machine. So again, we want to include all that pertinent machine information on each specific procedure. If you assign numbers to the machine, make sure to match the procedure to those correct numbers. Also, we want to make sure that they're sequential. And what do I mean by that? These procedures should be easily followed. Keep it simple. They should be easily followed. So sequential. The authorized employee should be able to follow that written procedure right through step by step. Okay, then the next piece is going to be to check and make sure that these procedures work. So initially, you're going to want to observe one of your authorized employees and make sure that they can follow the written instructions. What I write may not be clear to you. So it's going to be really important that if you're following one of my procedures, I want to be out there and I want to see you do it. And I want to make sure you can interpret what I created for you in the appropriate way. And that's so important. And you're going to find a lot of that out. I found a lot of that out. The way I wrote things wasn't interpreted the same way. And that's so important. And you'll get better and better at that. And then you always want to re-verify that the procedures work, and always verify, of course, that the machine is actually de-energized before the employees start working on that machine. One other thing to note is that employees or OSHA doesn't require employers to issue a work permit or keep a log or even a record of these events. Okay, some employers like to have these records, but how the permit system or log is set up and administered is completely up to the employer. Again, we'll say it again, that documentation is important. If it's not documented, it didn't happen. So, remember that as you're working through this. All right, now let's look at kind of the simple steps. I say the simple steps. One is you want to let the affected employees know you're going to be doing lockout tagout. Okay, obviously, those who are affected, those machine operators, everybody else, I'm going to be doing lockout tagout. Then we're going to want to shut down that machine. So standard process, shut down the machine. Then we're going to disconnect, or we're going to isolate the machine from the energy sources, okay, and whatever means is laid out in that procedure. Then we'll apply our lock and or our tag to make sure that it's secure. Then we're going to release or restrain any of that stored or residual energy. That's a very important piece that sometimes gets forgotten about. And if the possibility exists that we might reaccumulate some energy, we have to make sure inside our procedure that we account for that and we determine what that is. And then we're going to want to verify the isolation and that the machine is de-energized. Most important step out of all of these, verify that what you did worked. And then you can begin your servicing activities. So the next step is, well, removing the lockout tagout. So employees can be seriously injured or killed if someone removes that lockout tagout without their knowledge. Okay, it's critical that employees respect the lockout tagout, and only the persons who applied it remove it. During that procedure, especially when I'm starting things back up, there are some steps in there that the authorized employee is going to take into account that someone else may not even see. Removing tools, making sure that all the loose parts and all the components are all put back together like they're supposed to be, and then ensuring that that machine is operational. So we want to make sure that all those things are in place as we're going through the process of removing that lockout tagout. Then we're kind of reversing the process back out and starting up the machine. With that being said, I'll send it back to Cindy.
Thank you, Joe. Yeah, I always like that. I like to reiterate too that step of double checking that your lockout has worked. That was probably the one that
yeah.
I should probably just bold that one from now on so that we emphasize that one. But
most important step.
Most important step, just make sure it worked before you start working on things, right? So just moving on a little bit about grouping similar machines. So OSHA, again, they try to make sure that things aren't just a pain in your neck. That's not their goal. So they have this option of grouping similar machines. We've been asked by lots of employers if they can do this. And this would be things that use the same type and magnitude of energy in the same procedure. So let's say you have multiple press brakes. I see we had somebody ask a question about press brakes, so we'll use that as an example. If you have the multiple press brakes, but they might be different manufacturers, but they operate the same, they have the same type of energy, same magnitude of energy, you can group them. But they do all have to have those down. So if they have the same or similar procedures for shutting down, isolating, blocking, securing, and dissipating the energy that we've talked about, if they have the same way of affixing and removing the lock and tag out device, and if testing the equipment to verify the effectiveness of the procedure, like we just mentioned, if all of those are the same, you can group them together. For example, the stainless steel manufacturing facility I used to work in, we had several of those Cincinnati press brakes. We were able to group similar brakes into a single lockout procedure, and the same with similar die setting machines. So that's another good example. They do allow this when the equipment has the same or similar control measures as we mentioned. So just something to keep in mind there to make your life a little bit easier. Here's another surprise for you. You don't always need written procedures. A note in the standard says that under certain conditions, the procedure for a particular machine or equipment doesn't need to be in writing. Now, here are those conditions, right? Because again, we keep saying that which was documented, right, was done. So documentation and key, but here are those conditions. If the machine has no potential for stored or residual energy or the reaccumulation of stored energy after shutdown, if the machine has a single energy source, which can be readily identified and isolated, this would be like a drill press, maybe like a vertical bandsaw, bench grinder, things like that. The isolation and locking out of the energy source will completely de-energize the machine. And, okay, so that means all of these have to apply. And the machine is locked out during service or maintenance. But wait, there's more. The list goes on. Let's go on to the next page. There's more. A single lockout device will achieve a lockout condition. The lockout device is under exclusive control of the authorized employee. We talked about that with cord and plug. The service and maintenance does not create hazards for other employees. The employer is using this exception has had no accidents involving the unexpected activation or re-energization of any machine during servicing or maintenance. Now remember, this type of equipment still has to be locked out. It just doesn't have that written procedure. Again, Joe and I are in favor of written procedures because that just kind of takes out the guesswork, right? If you're curious about where to find this, you can see that in paragraph C, as in Charlie 4I. And I put that here on the screen for you. So with that said, Joe, what about my favorite, group lockout?
Yeah, let's talk about group lockout. So when more than one person works on a machine, employers, really must take steps to ensure that each authorized employee is individually and equally protected. So the requirement is that each authorized employee must apply their own lock to the group lockout device or group lock box. And really the simplest way to do this, if you look in the top picture there, is with that multi-lock hasp. Okay, and we can see there's 6 holes there. You can apply up to 6 locks. So each of the maintenance people, the authorized people, are able to apply their lock to that energy isolating device. Now that's great for a single, but when the job is more complicated or when lots of mechanics are involved, employers can cut down on the number of locks needed by using operations locks and a group lock box like you see in the bottom picture there below. So one person would apply the locks to all the lockout points on the machine. These are called the operation locks. Then the person who applied the operational locks locks all the keys in the box, and then the other authorized people can, add their locks to the box. So it really saves on, all these hasps and all these locks and everything else going on. The other authorized employees then still, OSHA says still needs to have the opportunity to verify the locking. So in the case of lockout tagout, and I have kind of some examples, but I know we're moving on the clock here. You want to make sure you want to take the time to make sure that even if your buddy locked everything out, double check the energy isolation, yourself, and bring it back before you work on that equipment. All right, shift changes. So one area you can find yourself in trouble is a transfer of a lockout. Seen it. It's important to train and make sure that your employees know what to do for shift changes. So the simple one, of course, is if I'm a first shift authorized employee and I'm working on a machine, I'm not done, it's the end of the shift, and I'm going to work on it tomorrow, no problem. You leave it locked out, you go home, you're good to go. Okay. But let's say that repairs are going to continue on that next shift. So what do? OSHA expects that the machine will continuously stay locked out. So that means, to be clear on that, what it means, if you look in my picture here, again, we use one of those hasps. That means that the second shift operator or authorized employee is going to come in, put their lock on before I remove my first shift lock. Okay, the machine will be continuously locked out. And I say that because I've seen this happen. What happens is I'm the first shift guy. I want to get out of here. I'm taking my lock off, and I'll tell second shift to put their lock on. That's when bad things happen. So we got to make sure that they're trained on the appropriate process to make sure that lockout tagout is continuously employed throughout the process here. So temporary removal of locks. And this can happen, OSHA says, in limited situations for tasks that require that re-energization. So for example, if I have a machine and there's some sort of test or positioning or something I need to do to continue on with whatever maintenance activity I'm working on, okay, then what OSHA says, okay, in this case, temporarily, you can fire the machine back up. So you're going to remove your energy isolating device. You're going to fire that machine back up, do your test, and then reapply. Essentially what you're doing is you're completing one lockout tagout procedure and you're starting it anew. But OSHA gives you, that opportunity to be able to do that. And in some cases, that just might be part of the procedure. The key here is you need to make sure you have it in your procedure that temporary option may need to occur. Okay, again, written and documented.
Okay, I think it's me now. So
it's you, Cindy.
yeah, thanks for going through those. Those are definitely areas where people get tripped up. So I'm glad you covered those. Let's talk a little bit about inspections. OSHA does require employers to conduct inspections of lockout procedures at least annually. So you remember when I talked about your training and stuff annually and all that? Well, here's where it comes into play where it's constantly front of mind. So your procedures do have to be reviewed annually. And then in that review, if you find these discrepancies or gaps or whatever, then you'll go back and offer the training. So that's kind of how we keep that front and center. So what this means is each energy control procedure needs to be separately inspected at least annually. You can do those in a rolling way, like September this year we do this one, and as long as you get it done before September on this group, and October you do this group, you can do that as long as you're rolling that annual, you'd be fine. It doesn't mean that you can't inspect equipment more often. Hint, hint, for training or mock OSHA audits is a good opportunity for that. As with most everything else, OSHA just wants to give you the flexibility in accomplishing this requirement. So they say OSHA says inspections have to be accomplished through or may be accomplished through random audits, plant safety tours, planned visual observations. I used to always use this as an opportunity for employee engagement. Put together teams, of employees, recruit people, enlist different groups from different areas to go through these and see if it makes sense, that sort of thing. So an opportunity to have employee engagement. These inspections can be done in different ways. You can have your authorized employees who normally use the procedure lock out a machine from an authorized person from one area, lock out a machine, see if the steps make sense. So different ways you can go about it, but just make sure that you're doing that annually for each one of your programs. Remember, the goal is just to make sure that the procedures are being followed and that people are being safe from unexpected energy. We've discussed grouping individual procedures for similar machines. The same concept can be applied for the inspections, as I mentioned. As part of a periodic inspection, all of the authorized employees who typically use a procedure must be included in a review of the procedure. Okay, so you want to make sure that you're involving the people that actually have to do this. If an employer uses a tagout instead of lockout, then the affected employees must also be included in the review. So make sure you don't forget those authorized and affected employees both. OSHA wants to make sure that employers are taking extra steps for tagout because that system, as you know, doesn't use as strong of a protection as a lockout. So make sure you're not forgetting that. Again, if you find deficiencies in your procedure, update those procedures and then follow up with the training. And don't forget to certify that those inspections are being done, right? We keep hinting on that. Make sure you identify in your certification the identity of the machine, the date of the inspection, of the procedure, employees that were included, and the person that did the inspection itself. A little bit about the minor servicing exception that Joe talked about. Again, performed under normal operations are exempted from the standard. We kind of already discussed that, but we just put a reminder slide here as we get towards the end of our presentation. This exception is limited, don't forget, and applies only when economic considerations prevent the use of prescribed energy isolation measures and when the employer provides and requires alternative measures to ensure effective protection, equal protection as a lockout would be, a normal lockout would be. The standard contains specific criteria that must be met for that minor servicing. Again, for changes and adjustments and other minor servicing. I think we have a question about alternative measures on press brakes, so this would be for you. Other minor servicing activities that take place during normal production operations are not covered by the standard if, remember, they're routine, repetitive, and integral to the use of equipment for production. Remember, it's required that the work is performed using alternative measures which provide effective protection. I think the question was specific to press brakes and how to do that. That might be a situation where you'll want to contact us. Use that safety management suite expert help question for your specific alternative suggestions that we might have. But to get back to this, the employer will have to state their case to OSHA if you're using these too. So when you do have alternative measures, you do need to justify why you're doing that. And then document your production process as to how you arrived at your conclusion, train your employees, and then OSHA will be satisfied with that. 3 specific criteria, again, can be used to determine if the exception applies to a particular activity. First, it must be conducted during normal production operations, we mentioned. Second, it has to be that routine, repetitive, and integral. Okay, so those are things. And then finally, if all of those things apply, then you must use those alternative measures. So again, we keep trying to pound this only because we get that question quite a bit. So we just want to keep reiterating that for you. To explain just a little bit further, let's take a look at an example. So if an employer was allowing employees to go on top of a machine that has 2 conveyor belts to clear jams, this was an established practice that had to be done to get out production every single night, and the machine would not work unless jams were cleared. Employees were used to kneeling on the conveyor that they had turned off. This is actually a situation in ag that we had dealt with. They had to turn it off so they could reach into the second conveyor belt where the jam occurred. Second conveyor belt was not turned off, and the employees were getting their hands and parts of their body on that conveyor. So OSHA allowed the minor servicing exception to apply in this instance, but did cite the employer for not using tools to clear the jams. Okay, so tools, being able to use something other than the human body to reach things to clear jams was what they considered an alternative measure. So just an example there for you. And that might work for the press brake situation, that question that we were asked. So this often brings up another questions. What are tools? According to OSHA, they consider tools push sticks, push blocks, things that are going to provide employees working with machines to keep themselves distance from the place of pinch points or points of operation. Push sticks may become damaged, lost, or otherwise need to be replaced. So OSHA will look at that. If that's your alternative means, you have to make sure those alternative means are up to snuff. So you're inspecting those to make sure that you can use them. And under no circumstances should employees put their hands in the hazardous operating areas of machines. So even with a tool, don't get too close to those operating points. All right, Joe, I know I'm going through that pretty quickly, but I'm going to turn it over to you for an overview on electrical lockout real quick.
All right, last section. Yeah, great. So OSHA does have more specifics on electrical lockout, and there are some key components to this. One is generally now you're required to have both a lock and a tag. And again, you can apply a lock without a tag under some certain instances, and they're pretty clear. Only one circuit or piece of equipment is de-energized. The lockout period's within that one shift, and employees are familiar with those procedures. So pretty logical, pretty basic. Let's move on to the next slide, Cindy.
There you go.
So we'll talk about something else with electrical lockout tagout. There's a little more specifics on who can do it now. So there's a little more qualification. And we do have kind of the description there of who that qualified person is. But again, they must have the knowledge and demonstrated skills in working with electricals. So this qualified person also, for electrical lockout takeout, must use electrical test equipment to test the exposed circuitry. So that's a skill, some knowledge in addition that they need to have. So when we get to removing the and re-energizing the equipment, again, you have to have that qualified person, and they have to be able to conduct those appropriate tests and visual inspections to make sure, including electrical jumpers, shorts, grounds, other devices. So it's just a little higher level amount of knowledge that's necessary when we come to electrical lockout tagout over mechanical lockout tagout. So, some other kind of similarities between you can use the same procedures. You just need to modify those procedures a bit to address kind of the bullets there. The specific electrical hazards, the requirements if needed. Do we have to use tags and locks? Yes, no. You're going to have that written in your procedure. And then, of course, in big bold letters, making sure that you're saying a qualified person needs to verify this de-energization process. So that's so important to the procedure for electrical. So keep that in mind, qualified person. Then I'll pass it back to Cindy.
Thanks, Joe. And whew, a lot of information, very important information. Lockout is so important. Sometimes I wish we could do a 4-hour session, and I'm sure people don't want to do that, but I like lockout, so I'd be happy to do that. But let's sum up some key points real quick before we go into Q&A. First, remember to document your lockout procedures, including for multiple shifts and group lockouts. You want to identify those employee roles, the authorized, affected, and other, and provide appropriate training. Again, don't forget your temporary workers and contractors. You want to perform and document your periodic and annual inspections on your procedures. And those must be conducted by authorized employees with another authorized employee looking on. Always good to have multiple sets of eyes. Make revisions to your procedures if they need updating, especially when equipment or operations change. And document why you think minor servicing exception applies to your certain situations in your facilities. Because if OSHA inspects your facility, you'll be all set with the necessary documentation that you need ahead of time. So want to make sure that you're doing that. And I think that brings us up to another poll, if I'm not mistaken. So we're going to hop into some of our questions. If you haven't sent yours in, now's the time to do so. Joe and I are going to, we'd also like to thank you for being here again today, and thank our event sponsor again, JJ Keller Safety Management Suite. Again, with your complimentary access, you'll be able to get a hold of the most popular safety management tools. And these include things like written safety plans, customizable training programs, audit inspection checklists, like we just talked about, inspecting your lockout procedures, word for word federal regulations, letters of interpretation, things like that, regulatory comparisons, and so much more. So go ahead and fill out that poll. You should see it on your slide now. And we will also are going to, based on your selecting your interests, we'll also send you our white paper, another white paper, right? So you get 2 of them. OSHA's top 10 violations. This just takes a closer look at those top 10 most frequently cited standards, including our topic today, lockout tagout. So I think I'm going to turn it over to Barry now for our Q&A session. Barry, are
Great.
you on?
Thank you, Cindy. Appreciate it.
Yeah, you bet.
Before we start the Q&A, I want to let everyone know that the evaluation survey we're asking you to complete, it will open in a different screen after this webinar. We're going to try to get to a couple questions here. And first of all, Joe, I wanted to share with you, Todd asks, does cleaning machinery fall under service and maintenance?
Sure, great question. So cleaning is kind of, I'm going to say it's kind of I need to know a little bit more about that term in itself. So, depending on what we're doing, again, if we are bypassing those safety features in order to complete this, then, it's going to fall under that service maintenance and all of a sudden fall underneath the lockout tagout program itself. If cleaning is that, like we talk about minor servicing or in the normal act of production, it's routine, it's a normal act, then not necessarily. So it really depends on exactly what it means to be cleaning machinery.
Great.
Hopefully
Thank
that
you.
answers your question. I need a little more specifics on the cleaning part.
Sure. Thank you for that. Looks like we have time for one more today. Cindy, I wanted to send one your way here. Danella asks about tag out on a steering wheel on a semi. And Danella says, I can't find a lock that will work. We take the keys out and put them on the floor of the truck. and I was going to have to a tag put on the steering wheel or ignition switch. Would that cover the standard in this case?
So technically speaking, Danella, yeah, absolutely. You could use a tag in that situation, but I would maybe go one even further, which is something that I did when I was doing agriculture, is I went and got one of the steering wheel locks that you can use the anti-theft device. So if it's something that the company wants to think out about, that might actually be a better option for you. But you could use a tag in that situation because a steering wheel is one of those pieces of equipment that isn't designed to take on a lock. So sounds like you're already doing a really good job at that, but yeah, consider one of those anti-theft devices as an option.
The club.
Great. Well, yeah, thank you. Well, folks, unfortunately, we've run out of time today. We certainly appreciate you taking some time to share your feedback via our survey. A big thank you goes out to our outstanding presenters, Cindy Pauley and Joe Prue, and of course, all of them from all the team from our sponsor, JJ Keller. This ends today's Safety and Health Magazine webcast. Take care, everyone, and have a safe day.